During a baptism in a small village church, the priest opened a book from 1944, and a strange seal appeared on the baby's forehead, marking it as property. The infant's eyes turned completely black as the mark burned into its skin, and the congregation watched in horror as the child began to speak in a language no one understood. The mother collapsed, blood streaming from her eyes, while the priest dropped to his knees, clutching the ancient book as his hands began to blister and smoke. Father Dominic had been performing baptisms for over 30 years, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened that day in the parish of St. Michael's. The Harmon family had brought their 6-month-old son, Oliver, to be baptized on what should have been a day of celebration and spiritual cleansing. The church was packed with family and friends, all dressed in their Sunday best, smiling and taking photographs as the ceremony began. The priest had begun the ritual as he always did, reading passages from the church's baptismal book, a weathered tome that had been used in the parish since 1944. The book itself had always seemed ordinary, its pages yellowed with age, its leather binding cracked and worn from decades of use. But when Father Dominic opened it to the page containing the blessing for that day, something extraordinary happened. A thin wisp of smoke began to rise from between the pages. At first, the priest thought it was just dust catching the light from the stained glass windows, but then the smoke grew thicker, coiling upward in an unnatural spiral. Those sitting in the front pews later described it as having a metallic odor, like copper pennants left too long in the sun. As Father Dominic continued reading, his voice began to change. Witnesses would later tell investigators that his words seemed to echo, as if multiple voices were speaking through him. The baby, who had been calm until that point, suddenly grew rigid in his mother's arms. That was when it appeared, a mark on the infant's forehead, circular in shape with intricate patterns spiraling inward toward a central point, and etched clearly within it a single word: property. Dr. Eleanor Walsh, an expert in religious symbology at Cambridge University, was one of the first academics to examine photographs of the mark. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the precision of the mark, she explained. It wasn't a random pattern or birthmark that appeared suddenly. This was a perfectly executed seal, similar to those used in medieval times to denote ownership of valuable goods or, in darker contexts, human chattel. The mark seemed to glow with a faint reddish light, pulsing in rhythm with the baby's heartbeat. Sarah Harmon, the child's mother, tried to wipe it away, thinking it was perhaps ink or some other substance that had transferred from the book. But as her fingers touched the mark, she screamed and pulled back her hand. Her fingertips were burned, as if she had touched a hot stove. By this point, several people had begun to leave the church, pushing and shoving to reach the exits. An elderly woman fainted in the third row, while a teenage boy began to vomit uncontrollably near the font. The child's father, David Harmon, attempted to take his son from his wife's arms, but as he reached for the baby, an invisible force pushed him backward, sending him crashing into a row of candles. What happened next defied all natural explanation. The baby's eyes, previously a bright blue, turned completely black, with no distinction between iris and pupil. Oliver's tiny body began to convulse, not in the manner of a seizure, but rather as if something inside him was stretching his limbs to impossible angles. Then came the voice. He spoke, Father Dominic later told police, his own voice barely above a whisper, his hands still bandaged from the burns he had suffered. Not babbling or cooing as infants do. He spoke words, clear, articulate words in a language I have never heard before, but somehow I understood what he was saying. When pressed by investigators to reveal what the child had said, Father Dominic refused, claiming that repeating the words might open doors that should remain closed. The priest's refusal to cooperate further with the investigation only deepened the mystery surrounding the incident. Professor Martin Blackwood, a linguist specializing in extinct languages, was brought in to analyze the audio recording captured on a parishioner's phone. The sounds coming from the infant's mouth shouldn't have been physically possible for a child of that age to produce, Professor Blackwood stated. The laryngeal structure of a 6-month-old simply cannot create certain phonemes that were clearly audible in the recording. Moreover, the language pattern appears to be pre-Sumerian in origin, a dialect that has not been spoken for over 5,000 years. As the bizarre scene unfolded in the church, the baptismal book that Father Dominic had been reading from began to change as well. Witnesses described how the pages seemed to become translucent, revealing different text beneath the standard baptismal rites. These hidden passages appeared to be written in red ink, though later analysis would suggest it wasn't ink at all, but something with organic properties matching human blood. Sarah Harmon, still clutching her transformed child, began to scream as blood started streaming from her eyes. Not tears tinged with blood, but actual rivulets of crimson flowing down her cheeks like macabre tears. She later described feeling an excruciating burning sensation behind her eyes, like someone was pressing hot needles into my brain. Church caretaker Elias Mercer, a 67-year-old man who had maintained St. Michael's for nearly 4 decades, attempted to close the baptismal book. "I thought if I could just shut that damn book, everything would stop," he told reporters from his hospital bed 3 days after the incident. "But when I touched it, I saw things. Visions of places no human was meant to see, and I heard whispers telling me that the child had been claimed, that the transaction was complete." Mercer suffered a massive stroke moments later and was left partially paralyzed on his left side. Doctors were baffled by the pattern of neural damage, noting that it formed the same spiral pattern as the seal that had appeared on baby Oliver's forehead. By the time local authorities arrived at St. Michael's, responding to frantic 911 calls from multiple parishioners, the church had nearly emptied. They found Father Dominic kneeling before the altar, the baptismal book now closed and clutched against his chest. The priest's hands were severely burned, with the same spiral pattern seared into his palms. Sarah and David Harmon were huddled in a corner with their son, who had, by all appearances, returned to normal, except for the mark, which remained visible but no longer glowed. Detective Inspector Claire Montgomery, the first officer on the scene, described the atmosphere inside the church as oppressively heavy, like the air before a violent storm, but with an underlying sense of malevolence that made it difficult to breathe. Her body camera footage showed static interference whenever she approached the Harmon family or Father Dominic, and the audio captured whispered voices that weren't audible to those present at the time. The baptismal book was taken as evidence and transported to the regional police headquarters for examination. But when forensic technician James Wong opened it the following morning, he found only blank pages. Every word, every passage that had been in the book for nearly 80 years had vanished, all except for a single page in the center of the book, which contained a detailed illustration of the seal that had appeared on Oliver's forehead, along with text in the same pre-Sumerian language the baby had reportedly spoken. Dr. Simon Reed, a pediatrician who examined Oliver 24 hours after the incident, found the child to be in perfect health. The mark remained visible on his forehead, but seemed to be fading slightly. More disturbing, however, were the results of the MRI scan. There were anomalies in the frontal and temporal lobes that I've never seen before, Dr. Reed explained. Areas of the brain that shouldn't be developed in an infant of this age were showing high levels of activity, particularly in regions associated with language processing and long-term memory. When asked what could explain such development, Dr. Reed admitted he had no medical explanation. It's as if someone had accelerated the development of specific neural pathways, but in a targeted, almost surgical manner. This isn't natural development. It's more like reprogramming. The Harmon family was placed under protective observation at their home, with round-the-clock monitoring by both medical professionals and law enforcement. For 3 days, nothing unusual occurred. Oliver behaved like any normal 6-month-old, laughing, crying, and sleeping according to his regular patterns. The mark continued to fade, and the family began to hope that whatever had happened in the church was behind them. Then came the visitors. They arrived just after midnight on the 4th day following the baptism. Security cameras around the Harmon residence captured 3 figures approaching the house from different directions. All were dressed in dark clothing with hoods that obscured their faces. Most disturbing was the fact that the cameras showed them walking directly through solid objects, fences, cars, even a stone wall, as if these physical barriers didn't exist. Officer Paula Jenkins, who was stationed outside the house that night, reported seeing the figures, but claimed they didn't look right. When pressed for details, she described them as almost two-dimensional, like shadows that had somehow peeled themselves off the ground and taken human form. Officer Jenkins attempted to intercept the intruders, but found herself paralyzed, unable to move or even call for backup as they passed within inches of her position. Inside the house, Sarah Harmon woke to find Oliver missing from his crib. Frantically searching the house, she found her son in the living room, seated on the floor at the center of a circle formed by the three hooded figures. They were kneeling around the baby, their hands extended toward him but not touching him. The mark on Oliver's forehead was glowing brightly once again. Sarah's screams alerted David and the medical personnel stationed inside the house. When they rushed into the living room, the hooded figures turned in unison to face them. Witnesses reported that beneath the hoods were not faces, but swirling vortexes of darkness, like miniature black holes that seemed to pull at the very light around them. Dr. Amara Okafor, the night nurse on duty, described feeling an overwhelming pressure inside her skull as she looked at the entities. "It was like my brain was being squeezed in a vice," she recounted, "and there were voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once inside my head. They were saying that the child was theirs, that he had been marked for a purpose, and that the transaction could not be undone." One of the figures extended an arm toward the assembled group, and a blast of freezing air knocked everyone except Sarah to the ground. The temperature in the room dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the windows and furniture. Sarah, apparently immune to whatever force had affected the others, lunged forward to grab her son. As her hands touched Oliver, the mark on his forehead flared with blinding intensity. The three figures recoiled, their shadowy forms seeming to ripple and distort. Sarah later described feeling a surge of power flowing through her body, emanating from a matching mark that had suddenly appeared on her own palm, the same spiral seal, but inverted, as if it were a counterpart to the one on her son. "Back away," she commanded, her voice altered in the same way Father Dominic's had been during the baptism. "He bears my blood before your mark. The contract is invalid." The shadowy figures conferred among themselves, their movements jerky and unnatural. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they dissolved into wisps of black smoke that seeped through the floorboards and vanished. The temperature in the room returned to normal, and those who had been incapacitated found themselves able to move again. Oliver appeared unharmed, though the mark on his forehead now pulsed with a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm. Sarah collapsed beside him, exhausted but conscious, the mark on her palm already beginning to fade. Subsequent investigation of the Harmon family history revealed something extraordinary. Sarah's maternal grandmother, Eliza Winters, had been a member of the same parish where Oliver's baptism took place. Church records showed that she had worked as a cleaner at St. Michael's during the early 1940s, specifically during the period when the baptismal book was first brought to the church. More intriguing still, Eliza's diary, discovered in the attic of Sarah's childhood home, contained entries describing strange occurrences at the church during the height of World War II. She wrote about a group of scholarly men who arrived one night in 1944 with the baptismal book, requesting that it be used for all future ceremonies at St. Michael's. They spoke of protection, one entry read, of binding the children to this world and keeping them from being claimed by what waits beyond. They said the book was a shield, but I fear it may be something else entirely. I have seen what is written beneath the prayers, and it is not the word of any God I recognize. Historical researcher Dr. Frederick Harper managed to identify the scholarly men mentioned in Eliza's diary as members of the Angelus Society, a secretive organization founded in the 1870s that claimed to study the intersection of theology and quantum physics. The society had been particularly active during both world wars, with records suggesting they believed that periods of mass death and suffering thinned the barriers between dimensions. The Angelus Society operated under the belief that human consciousness could be quantified and, more disturbingly, commodified, Dr. Harper explained. They theorized that souls could be traded or transferred between different planes of existence, and that certain entities from these other planes were constantly seeking entry points into our reality. The baptismal book, according to Dr. Harper's research, was believed to be a ledger of sorts, recording transactions between our world and whatever lay beyond. Each baptism performed with the book would, in theory, bind the child's soul more firmly to our reality, preventing it from being claimed by these other entities. But there was a cost to this protection. The Angelus Society writings suggest that they were essentially using these children as collateral in a cosmic bargain, Dr. Harper continued. The seal that appeared on Oliver Harman's forehead was their mark of ownership, not of the child's physical form, but of his potential, his future consciousness, his spiritual energy, whatever you want to call it. They were marking what he would become, not what he was. This theory seemed to be supported by the discovery of similar cases throughout history. Dr. Eleanor Walsh uncovered records of at least 17 other incidents spanning the last 150 years, all involving infants who developed unusual abilities after being marked during religious ceremonies. These children typically exhibited accelerated cognitive development, particularly in areas related to mathematics, languages, and what some reports described as pattern recognition beyond normal human capability. Most disturbing was the fate of these marked children. None lived past the age of 33. All died under mysterious circumstances, often disappearing for days before their bodies were discovered. Autopsy reports, when available, described inexplicable anatomical anomalies, brain structures that had reorganized themselves, unusual cellular formations, and in 3 cases, entirely new organs that had no known function. 6 weeks after the incident at St. Michael's, Father Dominic was found dead in his quarters. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the priest's housekeeper reported finding him seated at his desk, his burned hands pressed against a blank journal as if he were trying to write without a pen. The spiral pattern that had been seared into his palms was gone, apparently transferred to the pages of the journal, which now contained hundreds of pages of text in the same pre-Sumerian language the baby had spoken. Linguistic experts from universities around the world have been studying these writings, which they claim contain mathematical formulas and physical principles centuries ahead of current scientific understanding. Professor Elena Vasquez, a theoretical physicist who examined portions of the text, described equations that could potentially explain quantum entanglement in ways our current models cannot. If these formulas are correct, they represent a paradigm shift in our understanding of reality itself. The Harman family relocated shortly after the incident, changing their names and cutting all ties with their previous lives. Their current whereabouts remain unknown, though there have been unconfirmed reports of a woman and child matching their description being seen in remote communities across Asia and Eastern Europe. In each location, local residents speak of a young boy with extraordinary abilities and a strange mark on his forehead that becomes visible only when he uses these gifts. The baptismal book that started it all was supposedly secured in a climate-controlled vault at an undisclosed government facility. However, when a congressional inquiry requested access to it 18 months after the incident, officials reported that the book had disappeared from the vault, leaving behind only a fine dust that, when analyzed, contained traces of human DNA matching samples taken from Oliver Harman. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports that have emerged in the years since the St. Michael's incident. Religious ceremonies around the world, not just Christian baptisms, but coming-of-age rituals in various faiths, have been interrupted by the sudden appearance of the same spiral seal on participating children. In each case, the mark fades within days, but the children begin to exhibit the same accelerated development as Oliver Harman. Dr. Eleanor Walsh, who continues to track these cases, has noted a disturbing pattern in their occurrence. They're increasing in frequency, she explained in a recent interview. What began as isolated incidents separated by years are now happening monthly, and they're converging geographically, spiraling inward toward a central point. If the pattern holds, something unprecedented will occur when these marked children gather, whether by choice or by some unseen compulsion. The most recent development came just 3 weeks ago, when surveillance footage captured images of 3 hooded figures outside a hospital maternity ward in Boston. The timestamp on the video showed them arriving at exactly 3:33 in the morning, standing motionless for precisely 33 minutes before dissolving into shadow. The following day, nurses discovered that all 33 newborns in the ward had been marked with the now familiar spiral seal. Each mark was slightly different, containing unique variations in the pattern that, when compiled and overlaid, formed a larger, more complex seal. Experts who have studied this composite image suggest it resembles ancient astronomic charts depicting a celestial event that occurs only once every 5,000 years, an event that, according to their calculations, will take place 6 months from now. What does this connection between the marked children and this astronomical alignment mean? Are we witnessing the fulfillment of some ancient pact made by the Angelus Society, or perhaps something even older and more terrible? And what happens when all these marked children, these properties of whatever entities lurk beyond our understanding, reach the age of accountability? If you've experienced anything similar to the events described in this video, or if you've seen a child bearing the spiral mark, please share your story in the comments below. The patterns are converging faster than experts predicted, and understanding what we face may be our only hope of preparation. Subscribe to our channel for ongoing coverage of this developing phenomenon, and remember, not all baptisms are acts of salvation. Some are transactions with forces we were never meant to comprehend.